she's not given food by her husband and he's starving her, then she can go and find a way to live and survive, does not give us in the present day an excuse to say that we are emotionally unfulfilled by our spouse and therefore we can remarry. Because Paul and Christ are way too clear for us to be evasive in that way. Do we have any comments?
There's also no statement there in Exodus that woman who leaves can remarry.
Right. Right.
I have a question. Obviously, in Exodus 21, verse 10, it is basically talking about physical needs, but then it says conjugal rights.
Yeah.
And so, how couldn't somebody in the world, obviously this is kind of devil's advocate, couldn't somebody in the world say that this means that if they're not feeling emotionally satisfied, or if their sexual needs are not being met, then this is a reason to just leave? But then he's still not saying then you can go marry somebody
else. Right. Even in that case, he's not saying that this woman is free to remarry. And also in this food, clothing, and marital rights would have referred to the husband's obligation to help his wife reproduce and have children, right, which was an essential value in Israelite society. But when we expand that and say that our marital rights include our feelings of happiness, or feelings that our spouse gives us enough attention, or doesn't make us lonely, then we're really going far, far beyond even what an Israelite would have had liberty to do in that situation. Which, even as you're saying, even then it doesn't say that person can go and get remarried.
This verse says if he takes another wife.
Mm-hmm. Well, polygamy was still acceptable back then.
So that would make it apply even less
in our day and age, it's adultery, so
right.
It transfers differently.
This verse applies even less to us because there were different cultural rules.
Right. But adultery would certify divorce today.
Well, it's not entirely clear if he's talking in verse 10 about polygamy or adultery.
Yeah, but
today it would. Right. Right. Yeah.
So if you took another woman, that'd be adultery, and then this verse is...
Then we would be in the situation in Christ's case, saying that an adulterous spouse frees you.
Well, also, it's requiring faithfulness to the first wife.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In all aspects.
Yeah.
God is winking at the idea of polygamy, and theoretically, Solomon would have to take care faithfully of all of his 700 wives every time he got a new one.
Yeah, that's true. It was protective of women and marriage and children, despite the way that the Old Testament law is maligned today. The legal system, the legal grounds for divorce, and even accusations of abuse have become so incredibly flexible due to feminism's misandry, which means hatred of men, which is now enshrined in our law, that it literally says that you can classify emotional abuse as battery, which was once referred to as just physical, like actually breaking the law, doing something that was already law breaking, leaving your wife battered, literally. Now, today, refers to being overly critical, not spending enough time with you, making you lonely, isolating you, lowering your self-esteem. So women are permitted to deprive their children of their fathers for much, much, much less emotional trauma than what those children are about to undergo by having their family dissolved. And this, giving this kind of flexibility to these terms legally, is a parallel to the way that the church has given flexibility to these biblical terms about desertion and betrayal of the conjugal rights in Exodus.
I think probably the most heart-rending aspect about a divorce, even a no-fault type of divorce in the church today, is the children that are left there. And you have a spouse who has children. There's been no adultery, and yet that poor spouse maybe has been sinned against by a wife or a husband who has accused them of such deficiencies you're talking about. But are we going to be so cold-hearted, uncompassionate as to force that woman, even force that man to undergo the great trouble and cruelty and hardship of having to hold down a job and yet maybe take care of 3 kids for the rest of his life, And our emotions intrude and say, oh, no. The merciful thing, the compassionate thing, is to allow that parent to get married again for the sake of the children, so those children will have a new mom or a new dad. And it's very hard. It is very hard to come to a Christian who is a survivor of divorce and also has 2 or 3 children and say, you did wrong. You violated God's law, and now you are sentenced to take care of these children all by yourself for the rest of your life, and not do the supposedly compassionate thing of getting married to another woman at church, another man or woman, and doing right by these children. In fact, you're corrupting them, you're contributing to the delinquency of your children by not getting married again and providing a stable new home for them.
Mm-hmm. The research, is beyond clear that children do better when their parents do not remarry after divorce. And also, they're better if the parents split the time, if they spend a lot of time with their biological fathers, provided that father is not, obviously abusive, but that is such a rare, it is such a statistical minority that happens. Typically, abuse or violence only manifests after the force of the law has been used against a father to separate him from his children, to garnish his assets, and keep him restrained from even seeing his children, except for once or twice a month. And it is not even respectful of basic reality to say that children are going to be better off by someone remarrying, because that's just not been borne out by the last 50 years of research. Children would overwhelmingly prefer that their parents remain married, even if they're unhappy, rather than divorcing. And once they are divorced, children would prefer that they do not remarry, and they are incredibly higher risk of abuse, neglect, being passed over for the new children that get made, being shuffled around, and being troubled if that does happen. I would also just like to point out that, again, the research does not support a view of women as primary victims in this divorce epidemic. It's true that women are then most often the caretakers of the children, but even that is a miscarriage of justice, because most often it's the women that have initiated the dissolve of the family. And I don't have the statistic in front of me, but I guess I do. My articles, which I would encourage everyone to read, include statistics about how men are much more likely than women to delay a divorce because of concern for their children. The fatherly role is essential, as I said at the beginning, to children's well-being, and that is the biological father, not a new father. Obviously, there are exceptions to this, but unfortunately, churches, in their desire to cater to the exceptions, have changed the general theology of the church and made a principle out of remarrying divorced people without seeing if there was sexual infidelity or if the biblical requirements were met. And moreover, a woman who has divorced her husband has the entire force of the judicial system at her disposal to pursue that man for child support. That's just the facts. Men are more likely to overpay for child support than to underpay.
I think we should be aware that even in fundamentalist evangelical churches going back a century, they were unclear on exactly what Christ was saying. Clear back in the earliest memory of my father.
Yeah.
In fact, my father comes out of a very much of a holiness Methodist conservative background, and I remember a time or two pointing out to him, isn't this crystal clear that there can be no divorce and remarriage except for adultery. And astonishingly, none of this was really thought out, even in Wesleyan circles throughout the past century. So that right now we are extremely vulnerable because a hard-line, clear, and literal interpretation of Christ has not existed in evangelical churches. Mm-hmm. And therefore, because there's no real position statement, a widespread position statement on this in the church, then we're going off into these vagaries and nobody knows the difference.
It is a minority position. It does exist, but it is well in the minority, and actually it goes beyond a century ago because in the Protestant Reformation, the secularization of marriage and divorce happened because the Catholic Church had been so in control of, as it was very united with government, it was regulating marriage and divorce. And as the Protestant Reformation happened, the Protestant reformers encouraged the secularization of marriage. Martin Luther thought that it was primarily a civil event, not a religious event, and even he believed in the Pauline privilege that you could remarry if your unbelieving spouse divorced you. Even he didn't have clarity about it. I have a quote here from Christianity Today in 1997. It says, this process of secularizing marriage, turning it from a sacred covenant into a secular covenant, culminated in the second half of the 20th century, leaving most Protestant churches where they are today, with almost no binding internal policies on divorce and remarriage for church members, and most often not even for leaders. Civil law functionally regulates Protestant Christian marriage, divorce, and remarriage. So it's not primarily based on the Bible or even, what we can justify out of 1 Corinthians 7 or Exodus. It's primarily based on what the laws are. And as laws change, the church normalizes and kind of accepts that flow. And so that's why I'm saying that even though the church does still take a stand against homosexuality, it's just a matter of time before even homosexual marriage, that's because that's what they're pushing for, is going to be accepted, because there aren't these regulating forces within Christianity, within Protestantism or Catholicism, as we've recently seen, holding us to a biblical standard. And one of the reasons that I was so burdened and impassioned to write these articles and to share this tonight is because this is so under-discussed. It's not known enough. It's not known enough, the devastating effects on children. I mean, we can talk about that and say, divorce isn't good for kids. But to really understand the way that children are made that much more vulnerable to sexual abuse and physical abuse and being, ending up very maladjusted. I didn't even know how high those statistics were. And I primarily didn't know to what extent these laws are truly aimed at disempowering men and giving power to women.
It's a formidable thing to criticize a remarriage, which are super abundant in the church. And here are these little children there. Here's the newly remarried people. There's been no adultery. Mm-hmm. And you have to be willing to suffer the brickbats and the accusations of being harsh and cruel and judgmental. Yeah. I mean, nobody is standing up for Christ's hardline position. Right. It is supremely unpopular, and for that reason it is not discussed. It is certainly not adhered to. And this goes way back. I think of John Milton, the great English poet. He had a bad marriage when he was very young, in his early 20s. And in fact, he interrupted his budding literary career for a whole year or two to write articles justifying marriage on basis of incompatibility. The divorce on the basis of incompatibility and remarriage after that kind of a rupture. And so he remarried. Mm-hmm. We're talking about the quintessence of 17th century Puritanism. Right. He remarried. Right. He had several daughters. He even dictated, in his blindness of his old age, he dictated his greatest epic poems to these daughters, which were the fruit of a marriage, of a second marriage.
Right.
And there was certainly no adultery involved.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a great saint,
Mm-hmm.
a great Christian. Again, we find this so common that the church and advocates of this kind of remarriage will point and say, you can't deny that this family is better off. Look at the fruits. If the fruits of remarriage were evil, then look at how this family has been rescued.